Hello and welcome to this section of the Algebra Tutor. In this section we're going to switch gears a little bit and start to talk about what we call algebraic expressions. And we're going to start inching our way forward. In fact, this section is going to mostly be dealing with some definitions that you'll come into contact with as you explore algebra. You know, a lot of times in algebra, the concepts are not hard, but if you don't understand the words, if you don't understand the definitions of what the book or the teacher is trying to tell you, then the material is going to seem really hard when in fact it's not hard at all. In fact, none of this stuff is hard. You just have to understand what the heck we're talking about so that you can follow along. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about an algebraic expression. Anytime you see the word expression, you know, a lot of times in everyday language we'd say expressions. You know, we're talking about smiling or frowning or something like that. In algebra, an expression is like a grouping of terms. It's a grouping of things added or subtracted together usually. That's an entire expression. And inside of that expression, sometimes you have little pockets of things multiplied together, and those are called terms of the expression. So when you see, you know, look at this algebraic expression, all it's saying is look at this algebraic thing. Some things are multiplied, divided together. That whole thing is what we call an expression. So here we're going to be talking about translating these expressions from words to math. And a lot of times you'll see this kind of thing in word problems, for instance. So if you see something like x plus 3, remember x is a variable. I don't know what x is. X could be 2, x could be 5, x could be negative 3. It doesn't matter. I don't know what x is. It's just something. I represent it by a letter because I don't know what it is. If I wanted to translate this to words, which a lot of times you'll have to do when you're doing word problems in algebra, then what you might see is something like the sum of x and 3. The key word here is the sum. When you see the sum of something, it means you're adding things together, and you're adding a large number of things together sometimes, and sometimes you're adding just two things together like what we have here. What we're adding in this case is the sum of x and 3. So if I were to give you this sentence here, what is the sum of x and 3? Write it down in terms of algebra or an algebraic expression. You would write this guy here, x plus 3. What if you had something like x divided by y? How would you write that down in words in terms of algebra? The key word here is quotient. Anytime you see quotient, it means division, right? It's the quotient of x divided by y. So on a piece of paper, if you see something that says the quotient of x divided by y, that means x is divided by y, and that's how you write it in terms of math. So you see what we're doing here? I'm just sort of giving you conversion from math to words, because a lot of times in an algebra book you'll see the word quotient of something and you'll see the sum of something, and you know, it can get confusing if you don't know what they're talking about. What if you see something like 2 times x times y? How would you see that? Well, the key word for multiplication is the product. The product of 2x and y. So on a piece of paper or on a test, if you see something like, hey, what's the product of 2x and y? Write that down. And you don't know what x and y are, then you would literally write 2 times x times y, because the product implies multiplication. And the final one that you'll run into a lot is when you have subtraction. Let's say x. How would you write that down in terms of English? The key word here is the difference of x and y. So if you don't see any of this and you see on a test, hey, what's the difference of x and y? The difference between two things means subtraction. This is probably the most important things that we're going to write on the board in this lesson. Everything else, I'm going to give you a few more examples to give you practice. Basically, when you have things added together, it's the sum of the items. When you have them subtracted, it's the difference of the items. When you have them multiplied together, it's the product of the items. And when you have them divided by one another, it's the quotient of those items. So that's very important for you to understand. And these keywords, sum, difference, quotient, and product, are very, very important. You'll run into them in your algebra class, in your algebra textbook. You'll run into them when you take the SAT later on when you go to college or whatever, because word problems are always going to have these keywords in there, and those keywords tell you what math you're really trying to do. All right, so let's continue down the road here. Let's say we have something like 5 divided by x plus y. And I ask you, translate that to a sentence, right? Well, here's the deal. You know you have addition going on, so you know you're going to have the sum, right? And you know you have division going on, so you know you're going to have the quotient. So the best way to write this would be something like the following. And there's different ways, you know, but basically you have the quotient of 5 divided by the sum of x and y. It's the quotient of 5 divided by the sum of x and y. So you could literally not see this, and you could translate this back to math. It's the quotient of 5 divided by something. What is it divided by? Divided by the sum of x and y. 5 divided by x and y. X plus y. And likewise, what if you saw something like x times y times x plus y? Well, you know you're going to have multiplication, so you're going to have a product in there somewhere. And you know you have a addition, so you know you're going to have a sum. So the best way to write this is to say this is basically the product of what? Product of x, y, and the sum of x and y. So if you didn't see this at all, it would be the product of what? The product of x, y, and something else. The something else is the sum of x and y. And that would be the easiest way for you to write these things down. So moving right along, what if you had, what if we were giving you, in this case we've been giving you this and translating into words. Let's go the reverse way. Let's say you had the quotient obtained, I'm going to write obtained, O-B-T, obtained, when the product of 3 and z is divided by the product of 4 and x. Looks complicated, but it's not complicated. Because you have a quotient. It's a quotient obtained. That means you have division. Something has to be on top, something has to be on bottom. It's a quotient obtained when the product of 3 and z is divided by something. So on the top you have 3 times z. It's divided by something. What's on the bottom? The bottom is the product of 4 and x. So this is what you would translate that, 3z over 4x. It's the quotient obtained when 3 times z, when the product of 3 and z is divided by the product of 4 and x. All right, let's continue on. We have, what if we have the number obtained, so I'll just say obtained, like this, when the product of x and y is divided by the sum of x and z. Okay, so it is the number obtained when the product of x and y is divided by the sum of x and z. So we have a product of x and y, so x times y. The product of x and y, which is this, is divided by something. What is it divided by? The sum of x and z. Sum is with addition here. So x times y divided by x plus z, like this. Very, very important that you're able to translate these things, because when you get to word problems, you know, you'll have something like, you know, Jenny has 5 marbles. The sum of her marbles is equal to something else. And you'll have to know that the sum means adding things together. You'll have to know that the product means multiplying them together, and so on. Now what we're going to do is switch gears a little bit and talk about what we talked about a little bit in the beginning. Terms, coefficients, and expressions. A lot of these terms, you know, these definitions confuse people, but there's really no reason to be confused by this at all. Here we have, you know, an expression. This expression has only one term because there's only one sort of little unit together, 6 times d. And as a definition, you need to know that when someone talks about the coefficient, then what they're talking about is the number that sits in front of the variable. So this is the coefficient. So anytime you have a number sitting out in front of letters, which you're going to see a lot in algebra, the number is called the coefficient, right? And so on. So this is very simple because there's only one thing here, but let me go ahead and write a little bit more complicated one down, and you'll see how to deal with it. What if you had the expression negative x times y minus 4 times t plus 35? This whole thing is called an expression. The whole thing is called an expression, right? So let me write that down just to kind of show you. It's an algebraic expression. So here we go. This is an expression. In other words, an expression is like the whole enchilada. All right. Now, how many terms do you think are contained in this expression? A term is like a little nugget of goodness. They're all, either added or subtracted. This is a term. This is a term. This is a term of the expression. So how many terms do we have? We actually have 3 terms. So here we have 1 there, 1 there, and 1 there. So we draw a little nice little big fat arrow or something like this. We have 3 terms inside of this algebraic expression. So if on a test they say, how many terms do you have? Well, there you go. You have things added together. There are 3 of them, so that's called the terms, 3 terms. So what is the coefficient of the first term of this expression? Well, this is the first term. The coefficient is the number in front. So here, the coefficient is equal to, what do you think? -1. That's the number that's sitting out in front. I know there's no 1 there, but because there's always a 1 implied there, and there's a negative there, the coefficient's -1. What is the coefficient of the middle term? Right? Well, if you look at this, this is the middle term. The coefficient there is -4. Because that's the number sitting out in front. And then for this last guy, there's no variable here, so you could kind of say the coefficient's 35. But, since there's really no other letters there, you probably wouldn't be asked that. But if you just see a number, you could say the coefficient's 35. It's not as meaningful, though. Typically, coefficients are when you look at numbers that are sitting in front of letters. So let's give you another little example here, kind of drill this in a little bit more. Let's say you have something like -4 times x times y times z plus 7 times x times y minus z. First of all, how many terms are in this algebraic expression? Well, this is one term, this is another term bundled together, and this is another term. So there are 3 terms. That's the first thing to know. So there are 3 terms of this expression. And what I want you to find out here is, what is the coefficient of the first term? Well, you have lots of letters. The only number out here is -4. So the -4 is the coefficient here. What is the coefficient for the second term? The only number here is 7. So that's the coefficient. And the third term, what is the coefficient there? Well, the only number out here is -1. And again, I know you don't see a 1 here, but anytime you have a variable, there's an implied 1, so you have a -1 there. So you have 3 terms, term 1, term 2, term 3. The coefficients you're easily able to label. This is the kind of thing you'll be asked on your test to be able to identify. All right, moving right along, let's say we have 3 times x squared plus 4 times y plus 2 times z plus 2. This is an expression. It's a thing that's just presented to you, lots of things added together that consist of little terms added together. So how many terms do you think are inside of this expression? Here's a term, here's a term, here's a term, here's a term. So there's 4 terms in this algebraic expression, okay? So there's 4 terms there. Now let me ask you, let me switch colors. What is the coefficient of the first term? Well, there's only a 3 there in front of the variable, so the 3 is the coefficient. What is the coefficient here? 4 is the coefficient there. What is the coefficient here? 2 is the coefficient. Now this is just a number, so it's not so meaningful because there's no variable here, but you could still say that 2 is the coefficient of that last term there. So again, it's all about definitions. A lot of times on a test, you might be given an expression, and the teacher might say, what is the third term? What is the coefficient of the third term? Take the third term and add it to the second term or something. And if you don't know what a term is, or if you don't know what a coefficient is, then you won't be able to do the problem. But I mean, even a third grader could look at this and say, well, 4 is the coefficient here. I mean, because you can just read the numbers right off. All right, so what I want to do for the last part of this section is present a new concept that, you know, it's kind of important to know. What if you had 29 times x times y times z plus 23 times x times y plus 19 times x? How many terms do you see in this expression? Well, this is a term, this is a term, this is a term. So we've done this before. This is 3 terms. And again, I could ask you, what's the coefficient of this term? And you would tell me 29. And I could say, what's the coefficient of this term? And you would tell me 23. And I would say, what's the coefficient of this term? And you would tell me 19. And that's all correct. But what I want to do really is illustrate with this problem a new word that you'll see a lot. And that is the word called factors. Factors of a term, right? When you see that, what does that mean? Let's ask ourselves, what are the factors of the third term? Okay, the word factors really basically are just things that multiply together to give us the term that we're talking about. So what is the third term? Okay, 1, 2, 3. Here's the third term. What things are multiplied together to give us 19x? Right? It's pretty simple really, because what are you multiplying together? Well, you're multiplying together 19 and you're multiplying the variable x. So you would say that the factors of the third term are the things that multiply together to give you the third term. And that would be 19 and x. Pretty simple, really. So what if you look at the first term? Let's pick one a little bit more complicated. Okay, well, what's the factors of the first term? Well, what do you think is multiplied together to give us here? Well, I see a 29. I see an x, I see a y, and I see a z, and they're all multiplied together, right? So the factors of this first term are 29, x, y, and z. This is just a definition. The only reason to bring this up is to teach you that when you see the factors of something, the factors are things that are just multiplied together to give you that thing. The reason that it's important to know what that is because later on, again, we're building bedrock. Later on, we're going to be looking at larger, more complicated expressions, and it's going to be important to be able to look at it and figure out what's multiplying together to give you that thing, so that I can take, and do other simplification that we're going to learn how to do a little bit later on in the lessons, in the course, okay? So that is basically all I wanted to cover in this section. It's a section that's dealing with algebraic expressions. An algebraic expression is just a grouping of terms. The terms are the little things that are added together. In this case, for instance, there are 3 terms. You could be asked to identify the coefficient of the terms. That's just the number that's out in front of the variables. You might be asked to list the factors of the terms. Those are the things that are just multiplied together to give you that term. So more or less, this section was definitions. And as we go on into the future sections here in the course, we'll be using these terms a lot. We'll be using these definitions a lot. I might say, hey, here's an algebraic expression. Let's go find the factors. I might say, take the third coefficient of that term. We're going to do something with it. And you'll need to know, what's coefficient mean? What does factor mean? What is term? What is expression? And so I tried to kind of give you that stuff here. We also learned how to take and translate the math into a sentence. So remember, sum means adding things together. Quotient means dividing things with one another. Difference means subtraction. And product means multiplication. So make sure you understand those things. Make sure you understand everything we've talked about here, and follow me on to the next section where we'll continue building our skills with the most fundamental, absolute core essentials to do well in algebra.